Thanks, John. Our speaker for tonight is Dr. Bernard Gendron. Dr. Gendron is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He received his PhD degree from the University of Notre Dame. He has been a teacher at Fordham and the University of Texas prior to joining the faculty at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Gendron is the author of a book entitled Technology and the Human Condition, which examines the social role of technology. He has also written articles in the areas of political philosophy, the philosophy of science, and the philosophy of technology. Tonight, he will speak to us about the relation between democracy and technology. His lecture is entitled, Can Democracy Withstand Technology? At dinner tonight, it was suggested that maybe the title could be reversed. Can technology withstand democracy? And that could be another way of looking at the topic under scrutiny tonight. There'll be time for questions immediately following the presentation, and I'll reiterate what Professor Elrod said, that there will be a reception and refreshments after the discussion of questions. You're all invited, so please attend. And now, without further ado, Professor Gendron.
Well, I'm going to start by focusing the question a little more. My talk is primarily about what we might call the workplace, where we work, right? And so my question really is it possible to have a democratic workplace compatibly with the demands of technology? This, of course, in turn can have a lot of reverberations on our discussions of the possibility of democracy in the future in the light of advances in technology. Now, there are a couple of facts about the workplace that are fairly obvious. The first one is that as far as we've known since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, just about any workplace you're going to be in is not democratic. I mean, that's an obvious fact, with a few small exceptions like producer cooperatives. Another obvious fact about workplaces, especially, of course, industrial workplaces, is that technology is a very important factor in your environment. Now, recently there's been a call, the call is getting more widespread, for industrial democracy. Namely, some kind of system in which the people who do the producing do the controlling. And as can be expected, there have been a lot of arguments presented against this. Now, most people don't say that industrial technology is bad. They say really that it's not workable. Just won't work. And one of the reasons why many people say it's not workable is they say that given the complexities of the technologies of production, any attempt to democratize the workplace would really undermine our technological organizations. We would simply set production back. We would create inefficiencies. We would reduce productivity. We would curtail technological growth. Okay, now that view is very, very prevalent. It's the view that given our advanced industrial technologies, you simply cannot feasibly have democracy in the workplace. You've got to have, in effect, what we might call an authoritarian workplace, which in many cases is a bureaucratic workplace. Now, what I'd like to do tonight is look at the arguments for and against the view that technology, our advanced technology, makes democracy impossible in the workplace. Now, these arguments in turn can have some implication for talking about our society as a whole, because our government is becoming more and more involved in directing the process of production. And I suppose that the kinds of arguments that lead us to say that workers, producers, can't really control the workplace without messing up our technology, that argument could actually be generalized to say that as our government gets more and more involved in production, and of course in technological innovation and the like, that democracy there could be just as dangerous. I'm going to talk really about three views. I have to give them a name. So the orthodox view, since I assume it's the majority view, says that the conditions of advanced technology make democracy impossible in the workplace, be it a factory or be it a university. I'll also look at two responses to this view. One is the traditional Marxist response, and the other one I will call the alternative technology response. I'm going to try to do, I'm not going to really stick my neck out on this, except that I think I will side somewhat with the alternative technology view at the end. Which means ultimately I'll say that when you come down to it finally, the arguments that say that democracy in the workplace is unfeasible, technically unfeasible, simply don't have a strong leg to stand on. Now, I'm a philosopher, and we have certain nasty habits. One of them is heavy jargon. So I'm going to introduce some heavy jargon. I'm going to try to set up the problem at the beginning. Okay, try to sort of simplify things, clarify things, make a few distinctions. And then, in the light of those distinctions, we'll study then the three views that I mentioned. The orthodox view that says that democracy is simply technically unfeasible in the workplace, and then the two opponent views. Okay, the first thing we have to do really is think about the workplace and think about two aspects of the workplace. The technological side, the technological aspect, and the political side. So I'm just going to give a kind of definition of each of these aspects. By the way, I'm not reading a paper, so I've given you an outline which is even more complete than what I'm going to say tonight, so you can do what you want after the talk is over. The outline has everything that I'd like to say, but I'm sure I won't be able to say. And then on the first page, you'll see that I have some definitions, both of the technological aspect and the political aspect. Now, the trouble with technology is that nobody agrees very much on what we're going to mean by it. So, in fact, people use the word in quite different ways. And I think when you look at the workplace, there are at least two meanings involved. Now, the first thing we have to stress is that when you look at the workplace, and you talk about the technology about the workplace, you're talking about productive technology. There are many kinds of technology, right? There's technology for production, which I call productive technology. There's technology for war, call it warfare technology. It has different objectives. Then there's, say, political technology. Political technology is simply technology which allows you and teaches you how, among other things, say, to control the behavior of people. When I talk about the technology of the workplace, I'm talking about productive technology. And so now let's take a look at the two definitions that I give here. And I'll just simply read them. When speaking of productive technology, people are referring either to A or B. Okay, A, systematic practical knowledge for producing the most or the best outputs from given inputs, or for assembling the least costly inputs for given outputs. Okay, so one meaning of productive technology is simply it's productive know-how, knowing how to produce the best outputs given your inputs, or using the least costly inputs given your outputs. But sometimes technology is also used to refer to the instruments or to the organizations of labor or to the skills which somehow embody that knowledge. Okay, that's the second meaning of productive technology. I'm not going to get in too much I'm going to use the word interchangeably, but you'll know pretty well how I'm using it. Either the systematic productive knowledge or the instruments, organizations of labor which somehow embody that knowledge. That's the technological side of the workplace. Now the political side. By the political side, I simply mean the system of power relations which exist in the workplace. Anybody who's worked knows that where you work, there are power relationships. There are bosses, there are supervisors, there are people who take orders and people who give orders. There are people who hire and people who are hired. There are managers and there are workers. A workplace conceivably could be very authoritarian, that's one kind of political aspect, or it could be quite democratic, that's another political aspect. So essentially what we want to do now is talk about the relationship between the technological aspect and the political aspect. And here there are a number of questions that unfortunately bring up the heavy jargon. I'm not even sure that I need a lot of this. It's just that I'm just getting started on this and I use it as a crutch. We'll see, maybe you can help me on that at the end. There are a number of questions that come up, of course, as you look at these two different aspects, and I've got them in my little diagram here. There's the technological aspect and the political aspect. This box here stands for the place of work. First question is, of course, how distinct are the technological and political aspects? I've described them as if they're very distinct, but it's not clear that they are. The second question is, how do they interact? What kinds of relationships of dependence are there between these two different aspects? And another question is, what kinds of variations can you get for each aspect? What kind of variation can you get for the technology? And what kind of variation can you get for, say, the political structure? Okay, here's where my words come in. I have some words here. Monist, pluralist, autonomous, heteronymous, politically structured, unstructured, politically efficacious, inefficacious. I'm just going to describe those very briefly. I'm going to do it very abstractly. And then we'll drop them and they'll come up later, and I think you'll understand what I mean by them. I'm really looking at now this aspect over here, the technological aspect. I want to see how it relates to this. Now, one question is, technology we know develops, changes, right? And the question is now, is the development of technology dependent or independent on the kind of political structure you have? Does the political structure shape the development of that technology or not? If you think that the development of that technology is completely independent of the political structure, meaning, of course, it doesn't matter what kind of political structure you have, your technology is simply going to go its own way, then you'll think that the technology is autonomous. If you think that the technology is dependent on the political structure, then you'll say the technology is heteronymous. I'm sorry for those, especially for those two words, but okay. So I just surrounded the A and the H, but if you look at the outline, I'll simply summarize that view by simply putting A. Now, another question about the technology is whether or not at any given point in the history of the development of the technology, there are options, so that you might have two equally but distinct productive technologies, two technologies equally productive but distinct. If you think so, then your view about technology is pluralist. If you don't, then your view is monist. For example, people who think that there's only one way in which productive technology develops, say from crafts production to mechanization to automation, then you'll be a monist. Now, another question, which is actually a little complicated, this particular issue here, and you probably may not really fully grasp it until we get to the end, is the question whether or not there's a political dimension to that technology itself, whether or not that, if you want, inside the technological system, there are actual political relationships. Now, if you think that, then you'll think that really it's really false to completely distinguish the technology from the political side. If you think that, then you'll think the technology is politically structured. If I use an S somewhere, that's what it stands for. If you don't think that, if you think that there's nothing about the technology itself that is political, that, for example, there are no political power relationships within the technological system, then you'll think it's unstructured. Okay, the last issue, which might look like it's like this one, but it really is different, is the one question of what effect the technology has on the on the political structure. If you think that the technological structure that you have there will have a real important constraint on what kind of political structure you can have, then you'll think that the technology is politically efficacious. If not, then you'll think the technology is politically inefficacious. Okay, those are the basic distinctions, and all the different schools, all the different perspectives that I'll talk about really gravitate around these political distinctions. Now let's look at how people usually think about the technology. People usually think that technology is autonomous. That is to say that technology has a kind of logic of growth of its own, independent of the political environment within which it grows. Most people think that technology is monistic, that is to say that there's only one way in which technology can develop. Most people think that technology is politically unstructured. That is to say that there's nothing within the technology that's political. And a lot of people think that the technology is politically efficacious. That is to say that given your technical design, that puts all sorts of constraints on your political design. Now, the first thing I have to do before I go beyond this is correct this diagram, which is wrong. Let's see. Right. Now that will help that much. Now let's go discuss the orthodox view. The orthodox view, in effect, says what I just said most people say. It says that the technology is autonomous, the technology is monistic, the technology is politically unstructured, and the technology is politically efficacious. To put it another way, the technological side of the productive process develops on its own. There's only one way it can develop. Itself is purely, internally, so to speak, is apolitical. However, given that you've chosen a particular technological design, then you have to pick a particular political design. Now, add to this the further assumption, which the orthodox view makes, namely that industrial technology, which now grows on its own, etc., requires an authoritarian work structure, most probably bureaucratic. Okay. First thing we'd like to do is just very briefly look at arguments for that position. And the arguments, I've summarized a whole bunch of arguments on page 2. Now, let me just say something about arguments for this view, that the technology really constrains and determines the political structure. It is the standard view of, say, people like Max Weber, plus most industrial sociologists. It is also the standard view of Frederick Taylor and most management theorists. However, try to find an argument for it. I think people think it is so obvious that industrial technology requires an authoritarian, undemocratic structure that they never argue for it. You've really got to kind of look through the literature and see if you can piece something together, which is what I did. It's really very frustrating, because you have to read through a lot of very boring stuff before you finally find some remark that's... Most management books assume that the workplace will be authoritarian, period. They don't even argue for it. But I've tried to reconstruct some arguments. Okay, now there are two basic kinds of arguments that people have used. That's why I've got my two little arrows here. The T stands for technology. The P stands for the political structure, which in this case now will be authoritarian. And WC stands simply for worker conditions. Okay, there are two basic kinds of arguments. The first one goes like this. The design of industrial technology requires, for the efficient working of the technical system, that we have a bureaucratic, authoritarian workplace. It's a kind of what you might call prescriptive or normative argument. Namely, you say, look, your technology will not be productive, will not be efficiently used if you're democratic. Okay. Now there's another kind of argument which is a little more subtle because it's more indirect. It doesn't say that the technology directly requires for efficient functioning an authoritarian workplace. It says, you know, once you've established that technological design, it's going to have some repercussions. It's going to have a byproduct. And a byproduct of industrial technology is an authoritarian structure. And this is the way it works. The technology has a real effect on the workers. It shapes them, so to speak. And it shapes them in such a way that they are neither willing or able to engage in the process of participation in decision-making. Okay? So in the first argument simply goes straight from here to here. It says, given the requirements of the technology, you need an authoritarian political structure. The second argument goes like this. Your technology comes in, you've got it there, it affects the mentality, the attitudes, the intelligence of the workers, and makes them unable or unwilling to partake in a democratic process, hence an authoritarian structure. I'm just going to mention two arguments that, one argument representative of each. The first one, representing this kind of requirement thing, comes from John Kenneth Galbraith. All right, it goes something like this. Look, in modern production, there are a lot of very high risks. The market keeps changing from day to day. Who knows what's going to happen, right? Meanwhile, the technology that you're using is very sophisticated. You have to keep changing it all the time, and it's very expensive. So you can't have every, Johnny-come-lately come in and make decisions about that. Essentially, only experts can plan in a rational enough way so that the firm will survive. So therefore, he concluded that we'd have chaos, disaster, if in fact it was the case that people other than experts made the decisions. So his conclusion is that expert managers must be the controllers of the industrial firm. Stockholders, workers should stay out of it. That's basically Galbraith's argument. You notice it's a very abstract argument, right? And most of the arguments of this kind are very abstract. Because you're talking about this thing called technology, and you're talking about this thing called its requirements, whatever these are. Now, the second kind of argument is perhaps best exemplified by Robert Blauner in his book called Alienation and Freedom. And I have the summary of the argument pretty much on page 3. In fact, I think I'll read it. Authoritarianism in the workplace is a byproduct of modern industrial technology. Mechanization and the division of labor, where workers just do very small tasks in repetitious ways, mold workers in ways which make them unfit or uninclined to participate in the governance of the workplace. These modern technologies reduce the workers' autonomy in their work. They eliminate skills. They add to the meaninglessness of work and generate social isolation among the workers. This in turn leads to, among workers, ignorance, mental stupor, passivity, low self-esteem, cynicism, and absence of collective spirit, hardly the proper mental traits for democratic participation. Okay? So that's now the more indirect argument. Now, someone a long time ago saw the implications of industrial technology in this way, namely that they actually ruin the worker. They make the worker unfit for democratic participation. By the way, one obvious implication of this is that if the workers are unfit for democratic participation in the workplace, they're also unfit outside the workplace. This is from a quote from, goes back to 1776, and it has to do with the division of labor. You know, the fact that workers do tasks are subdivided into very simple tasks. And it actually was written by one of the greatest expositors and proponents of the division of labor, Adam Smith, who's also the father of modern economics. You might almost call him the poet laureate of the division of labor. He just exuded with enthusiasm for the division of labor. But this is what he says happens to workers under that system. In the progress of the division of labor, the employment of the far greater part of those who live by labor, that is, of the great body of the people, comes to be confined to a very few simple operations, frequently to one or two. But the understandings of the greater part of men are necessarily formed by their ordinary employments. The man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations, of which the effects too are perhaps always the same, or very nearly the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding, or to exercise his invention in finding out expedients for removing difficulties which never occur. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. The torpor of his mind renders him not only incapable of relishing or bearing a part in any rational conversation, but of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently of forming any just judgment concerning many, even of the ordinary duties of private life. Of the great and extensive interests of his country he is altogether incapable of judging, and unless very particular pains have been taken to render him otherwise, he is equally incapable of defending his country in war. I mean, a pretty useless person, actually. And then Smith goes on to compare the modern civilized detail worker to barbarians, who he says can do anything. I mean, they have this kind of broadness of mind because in a barbarian society, you have to be able to hunt, you have to be able to gather, you have to be able to make war and cook and build huts and so on and so forth. Everybody has to be able to do that. Therefore, then in a barbarian society, everybody can partake in the governance of that society, whereas in an industrial society, as he puts it, the mass of the lower people are so drowsy and stupid that they can't do anything. Now, unfortunately, that's a very persuasive argument. Okay. That's pretty much now all I have to say about the orthodox view, and I'll simply take a few moments to turn the blackboard around. Let's go on to Marxism. Now, you all know the Marxist line, right? Marxists say this: well, the authoritarian structure of the factory is not due to technology, it's due to capitalism. Once you go make the move to socialism, then of course you're going to have a democratic workplace, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so the source of emancipation is really socialism. Now, if you go now to ask Karl Marx exactly what reasons he has for saying that, his reasons aren't quite so clear. In fact, in my meanderings through his work, I found actually two sets of incompatible reasons. It depends really, again, what Karl Marx really accepts. Generally, Karl Marx accepts a lot of things that the orthodox view accepts. For example, he's a monist. That is to say, he thinks that there's only one route for technology. He also thinks that technology itself is internally neutral. It has no political structure. However, in one version, Marx wants to say not that the technology of the workplace shapes the political structure, but the other way around. It's the political structure that shapes the technology. However, since he's a monist, there's not much that the political structure can shape, because all it can do really is, if you've got a good political structure, it will stimulate technological growth, but it can't really control what you'll get. It'll only control how fast the growth is. So in this version, he thinks of technology as heteronymous. And also in this version, he thinks of technology as really inefficacious. That is to say, technology really doesn't influence the political structure. In this version, he pretty much has the view, that the kind of neutralist view about technology, that technology, can be used for bad or for ill. Okay, you've heard that line, right? Bad people use it badly, good people use it well. And so he thought that, okay, so take the assembly line. In capitalism, the assembly line is associated with a highly bureaucratic structure. In socialism, the assembly line, or whatever, will be associated with workers really controlling the process of production. Okay, that's one line you get, and you get that especially in his work, Capital. But I think Marx was really of two minds about this. He was really impressed with the enormous impact that a technological design does have on your social environment. So there's another Marx. This other Marx, in fact, accepts all the underlying assumptions of the orthodox technological view. Technology is autonomous, monist, politically unstructured, but efficacious. Not only that, but in these other moments, he seems to accept the view that, that at least in the early industrial period, the technology necessitates an authoritarian structure. What's the solution in the second argumentative line? Is to say, well, in the future, we're going to have a new technology which will make democracy feasible, which is automation. That's actually a fairly familiar line. A lot of people today who say that things with the assembly line are terrible look to automation to save us. They think that automation will bring back skills, will increase the amount of autonomy the workers have in the workplace, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, I'm not going to stay much longer on this thesis. For one thing, I don't know how much time I've used up so far. How much time have I used up?
Oh, about 35 minutes.
Ooh, okay. Then I certainly won't stay much longer in this thesis. Give me about another 15 minutes. But I think that neither of his arguments work. They work somewhat, but not that well. If you look at his second argument that puts all his faith on automation, the facts about automation and its presumed liberatory or whatever implications are very, very controversial. Some people say that automation will make things better for workers in whatever way, and some people say not, okay? And who knows, okay? So we'll put that aside. Now the other thing is I think that Marx really, let me put it this way, I think there's one set of arguments that he really hasn't undermined. So that it makes them really uninclined or incapable of really engaging with energy in the governance of a workplace. I think those arguments are very powerful, and they're backed up by a lot of evidence. This means, of course, that if you allow that, then you have to admit that the technologies as we know them do have a large political impact. They do shape, in an indirect way, the structure of the workplace. So what do you do about that? Well, here's now where I unveil the other position, which you might call the alternative technology position. And I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. In this view, you can see that technology is politically efficacious, that it has some influence on the structure of the workplace. But that's the only concession you make to the orthodox view. You ditch all the other assumptions. In this view now, I will think that technology is politically structured, that technology is pluralistic, and that technology is heteronomous. Okay, let me go through that very, very briefly. Why does technology have such an impact on the political structure of the workplace? Well, one argument could be is that the technology itself has a political structure. Okay, now we have to change our ways of thinking about the technology. Now, what does this mean? Well, very briefly, it comes down to something like this. So again, I said, now we've got to distinguish between technology as a system of ideas, knowledge, or technology as a set of instruments, or organization of labor, or set of skills. Well, as a system of knowledge, technology can have a political structure if you try to articulate that system of knowledge and find, say, political values. Or, remember now we're talking about productive technology. Suppose that in a system of knowledge, which is a productive technology, you find in it also a technology of power. That your productive technology tells you how to produce efficiently. A technology of power, or political technology, tells you how to control people. Suppose you found out that these two things were completely intertwined. That in the modern world as we know it, you can't really have a productive technology which doesn't have some political technology tied up with it. But they go hand in hand. Well, that would tell you that the technology is intrinsically political. Now, if you look at technology rather as a system of machines or organization of labor, then to say that it's intrinsically political, that it has political structure, would be to say that you find political power relationships within, say, the organization of labor. Or that actually in the organization, in the relationship of machinery and humans, you find political power relationships. Okay, now the alternative technology view, what it says is this. The reason why the technology has an impact on the political structure is because it has itself a political structure. So a technology with an authoritarian political structure will tend to reinforce those surrounding political structures which are authoritarian. A technology which are democratic political structure will tend to reinforce those surrounding political relationships which are democratic. Okay, that's where I talked about E and S now. Now, the other interesting feature, however, is this that saves us, according to alternative technologies, the following thing. That at any given point in time, there is a choice between competing technologies which have different political structures. So that, say, the firm at a particular point in time is a choice between a technology which is basically in structure authoritarian or a technology which is basically democratic. Okay, now the ultimate point is this, is that the choice of this technology is not independent of human will. The political structure of your workplace will determine whether or not you pick a technology which is authoritarian or a technology which is democratic. So if you have, take for example this scenario, descriptions here of capitalism. It's clear that if you look at the history of the firm in capitalism, there's been a constant struggle between management and labor over control over the production process. And now suppose that you're a manager in a capitalist firm. And supposing you did have a choice between developing a technology which enhanced your power over workers and a technology which was basically democratic, which one would you pick? Well, you'd pick the one that was, if you're smart, pick the one that was authoritarian. Right. So what the alternative technology view says is something like this. There is a way out. Namely, you have to pick democratic technologies. How do you do that? Well, first of all, you have to change the political structure of the firm. Now, let me give some examples. This is all on page 5. Let's start off by the modern division of labor. Now, one could argue this point. One could argue that if you develop the division of labor to its extreme form, now the division of labor is a technology. It's an organizational technology. It's a way of organizing the workforce. Then that division of labor technology is going to require a technology of control over workers. Because once you've actually reduced workers to performing simple, repetitious operations, you've turned them into cogs. And cogs have got to be controlled in a scientific way. Now, one classic example of this is scientific management. When Frederick Taylor introduced scientific management, he made it clear that his technology, which is scientific management, is both a technology for production in the mode of the division of labor and also a technology of control. This is what he said is crucial to scientific management. Number one, reduce tasks to create as many subtasks as possible and make them as simple as possible. Number two, take all knowledge that's in the workforce and put it in the heads of management. In other words, the management has all the knowledge. Number three, management should scientifically train and select workers. Now that's control. And finally, management should plan every movement the worker makes in a scientific way. That is control. But it is control built into production and productivity. So what Frederick Taylor says, you want to develop the division of labor as efficiently as possible, you will not be able to do it unless you incorporate into your productive technology a technology for manipulating people. Pure and simple. He never made any bones about that. Now, let's take a look at the idea of an alternative approach to the extreme division of labor. There's one obvious alternative, which in fact has been tried recently. Job rotation. Right? In both the division of labor and job rotation, what you do is you take advantage of the fact that you're more productive if the same thing, operation is repeated by the same person. In the division of labor, what you decide to do then is to make one worker do always the same thing. In job rotation, you make one worker do something for a while. Suppose if they're manufacturing pins, elongating the pins for a while, or cutting the pins, and then in the afternoon putting the heads on the pins. Okay, that's job rotation. Now, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, capitalism did not pick job rotation as an obvious alternative. It picked the division of labor. Now, it may be because the division of labor is more productive and efficient. I won't go through the reasons, but in terms of efficiency, the division of labor has no advantage over job rotation, as far as we know. There are very few arguments given in favor of it. So that in that case, the choice of the division of labor was a choice that had political ramifications as well as technical ramifications. Let me give another example. Now I'm going to go away from the organization of machinery to, organization of labor to machinery, to mechanization. Now, if you look at the introduction of machinery, as we know it classically, clearly it had advantages in terms of productivity. It was purely a technical thing. But the introduction of machinery was clearly political also. The political advantages of the introduction of mechanization were at least twofold. The first one was the destruction of the crafts, of the craft tradition. And there was a political reason for that. Secondly, the machine is actually a form of inanimate supervisor. Let me go to the first point first. By the way, if you want to get the evidence for this, read almost any person who wrote in the 19th century when mechanization was being introduced and spoke for management. The biggest problem for management in the 19th century was not productivity, it was discipline. Discipline over workers. For example, if you read this guy by the name of Andrew Ure, U-R-E, he wrote a book called The Philosophy of Manufacturers in 1830. And if you look at what he says, it's something like this. We've got to get rid of the craftspeople. They are unpredictable, they are capricious, they are recalcitrant, they are militant, and they strike. And the great advantage of machinery is that, as he saw it, is that it will eliminate the need for crafts because what the machine does is simply embody the skills. See, his idea was something like this, that the best worker is a worker who works like a machine. To work like a machine is to work in an unvarying way. What the machine does is, number one, eliminates the crafts, and then leads to the second thing, which is functions as a supervisor. In two ways. It functions as a supervisor in the sense that it regulates the behavior of the worker, organizes that behavior in a regular way. No supervisor could do that job. I mean, if you think of the assembly line, where you can't even go to the John, right, unless you get permission if someone can take your place. You know, and the supervisor doesn't prevent you from going to the John. The machine prevents you from going to the John. And also, of course, another important element of machinery is the speed up, the quickening of the pace of work. When Ford introduced the assembly line in 1910, productivity, so to speak, the amount of time in which it took to produce a machine was reduced by tenfold, so productivity went up tenfold. But part of those increases of productivity were due to speed up. According to estimates, when the assembly line was first introduced, it increased the amount of work each worker had to do by 2 to 3 times. Okay? That's the machine now as a supervisor, which in effect makes workers work harder. Now, we've heard economists say that machines embody skills. Now, I don't know what that means. But if machines can embody skills, they can embody power relationships. The machine can represent the power relationship between the worker and the supervisor. And as a matter of fact, studies of different levels of production have shown this, that when you go from a more craft-oriented industry to mass production, the amount of supervisors you need, immediate supervisors per worker, goes down. Although everybody concedes at the same time that the disciplinary problems go up. So the only thing you can conclude is that the machines take up the slack for the absence of the other supervisors. Then when you go back to automation, then the amount of first-line supervisors to workers, that percentage, goes up again. Okay. Now, were there alternative technologies to the form of machine technology that was introduced in the 19th century? Well, we'll never know, right? Because those experiments weren't taken. But I do list on page 6 two alternatives that we know of recently. The first one is a very interesting one, and it was really discovered by David Noble, who wrote a book called America by Design. You all know what's happened in the machine tool industry when it became automated. The machine tool industry was one of the strong bastions of crafts production, because there you are producing batches of commodities made to order. It's not standardized production. Well, what happened, of course, is that numerical control was introduced. Now, in the case of numerical control, rather than a craftsman controlling all the various movements of the machine to produce this particular kind of part, you simply now program the machine by some kind of punch card, say, to perform that particular operation, thereby putting the skills now on the side of management rather than the skilled craftsman. Now, in the 30s and 40s, when people were working on numerical control, General Electric apparently was working on another kind of design also, called the playback system. In the playback system, control is left in the hands of the craftsman. It is a form of automation which keeps control there, because in this particular case, instead of someone on the management side programming the lathe, for example, to produce what it does produce, the craftsman, suppose he has 100 widgets to produce, right, a special order. He will work the machine through its pace for the first widget. The machine will record all his operations and then play them back for the next 99 widgets. That is to say, the machine then automatically produces the next 99 widgets after the first one was produced. Now, the difference between that and numerical control is that it keeps knowledge and control in the hands of the craftsman, whereas the other one puts it more on the side of management. Now, what they're trying to do at MIT right now is to set up a prototype of the... See, it's hard to get records as why that project was dropped. I mean, try to find a record, right, at GE. For many cases, of course, files aren't kept. But they're trying to set up a prototype at MIT to see if, in fact, the playback system was as efficient as the numerical control system, and then to find out why numerical control finally won out over playback. I'll just mention another alternative technology, in fact, which Sweden has been using, namely that to the assembly line, there clearly are some alternative technologies, which Volvo, for example, is still experimenting with, the so-called team approach to building a car, and I won't say any more about that. Let me make a few concluding remarks. The first one, I think, to keep in mind is that with respect to the orthodox view that the authoritarian structure of the workplace is dictated by technology, most of the arguments are quite weak, with the perhaps exception of one, which focuses on the effect the technology has on the worker's head. Number two, you can now today, apparently it's possible, the evidence is still not completely in, concede that the present technology does reinforce authoritarian structures without thereby concluding that we have to live with authoritarian structures, because now we can perhaps argue that there are alternative technologies. Which leads to the third conclusion, that if you were going to take a stand in opposition to the orthodox view, then you'd better not do what Marx did, which is to concede all their assumptions. You've got to deny the fact that technology is autonomous. You've got to deny the fact that technology is monistic, that is to say that there's only one way at any given time to produce something in the most efficient manner. And you've got to deny that technology has no political structure, that it can be easily distinguished from the political environment. If you deny all these three things, then there's possibly an argumentative chance for making the claim that a democratic workplace is technically feasible. Thank you.
I assume that there are probably some questions that have been provoked by Professor Gendron's lecture, so I'll turn the question and answer